Hello, hello. Some jazzy
I know it's like some jazz,
music going here. Welcome to The Trust, the show about community management where we chat about trust. It's called The Trust. We're building a trust of community managers who spend their time building trust. And that's the goal of it. So, obviously, all communities, just to sort of reset on the premise of the show, trust is the thing that you're trying to build to work to so that communities function properly, do well, thrive, so that you don't have to coach them as much. And we want to talk with community professionals who are very skilled at building that trust. And today, I'm very lucky to have Shannon Emery, a former direct colleague of mine and a peer of mine and a friend of mine, a fellow Arlington/Alexandria, Virginia resident, and just an all-around great community person on the show to talk about something that isn't specific to community managers, but in her case, as a community professional, burnout happens. And we're going to talk about her experience with it, as well as how you might be able to avoid it for yourself, and how those of you running community programs or starting community programs can avoid burnout for your people. So without further ado and rambling from me, here's Shannon.
Right? You gotta love a good rambler. I think community managers have that tendency. We love to share things. So probably could,
Yeah,
I would say make for good salespeople too, just to get people to stop you from talking all the time. So you can sell almost anything,
that's
right?
what you want. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, right. Exactly. Perfect example in the first 30 seconds of this. So hey everybody, my name's Shannon, Emery, and like Paul has said, we have worked together before as well as think we're like friends now, I guess.
Yeah,
We hang out in real
I'd
life
say.
and stuff. He's cool. But I've been in working in the community management industry for almost a decade now, specifically in the B2B SaaS space, where companies are either taking their companies to the cloud or are there and are scaling. And so I really like what I do, but I want to share today like where burnout has led me. How you can kind of help build programs, things that are around making sure that you're being taken care of, as well as your members. And yeah, maybe a giant group hug at the end. But yeah, so I'm here to chat. Please use the chat, ask questions. I dropped some resources in there to get started. I have examples from other community builders. If you see me looking down today, I'm checking out my iPad or my tablet, excuse me. I call everything an iPad for some additional stuff because I'm yeah in between roles right now. So yeah, let's have some fun. But yeah, thanks for having me on, Paul. Thank you, Agora Pulse, for doing this. I think it's important and excited to have a candid conversation.
Are you kidding? I'm so excited. The number of subscribers to this event that we got, it dwarfed anything that I could come up with. Shannon is beloved on social media, one thing she won't give herself credit for. And let's talk
Yeah.
a little bit too, before we get all the way into it, like your journey
Yeah.
into community management, because I think that's one of the most fascinating things about community people is how they got there. Because these days there are people who can go into it right after college, but if you're in our millennial age bracket, and I'm probably pushing it a little to call myself a millennial, you are definitely one.
Thank you.
Typically you started somewhere else and kind of meandered into it. So I'd love to hear your story from the beginning.
Yeah. Oh, community. I am that typical case you hear about. Like, Adrian Spire just wrote a book called The Accidental Community Manager. I haven't read it yet, but like the title alone, I was like, man, that's just my life. So back in, I was since it's been about a decade now, around 2013 or so, we were in a recession and I needed work. I had funny enough, quit my first job as a community manager, but in real estate called property management. And there weren't a lot of jobs around at the time. So I went and did temp work for a company called Blackbot, where I was in their finance
Mm-hmm.
department. Um, I walked in that building, no ambitions whatsoever, but I said, I want to work in this big ass fancy corporate building. That was
Mm-hmm.
the objective at that point. And so continued to work with their finance team as a temp, started doing, process improvements, showing them how to do things differently, all that good stuff. But you don't want me doing your accounting. Let me just put it that way. So started to look around at the organization and ended up in the support department. And Yeah, a couple of years into it, they asked me, they're like, we need somebody to run our social handles, which is why my joke inside your community of like, I know how to be a corporate robot circa 2011, because that's what social media was at the time. Like, hello, how may I help you? Kind of vibes. And so I handled their social media, but also their legacy communities. And at the time, the company needed to consolidate those. Um, I would say Blackbot was actually ahead of the game as far as like community and how to utilize it, funny enough. But I got to be part of that team, impressed them enough that they invited me to be part of what is still known today as the Blackbot community team. And the rest, as they say, is history. But I've worked for companies like Higher Logic recently at Ultrix, doing various things, either programming or planning or platform execution or picking vendors, anything that you can think of in that space, but just with a very corporate tech spin. Um, but I love what I do. Like that's a part of this conversation today is knowing that you can burn out even if you really love what you do for your job. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of me in a nutshell. Accidental. No intention to ever become a corporate SaaS-based tech community manager, my friends. Happy accidents, right? Kind of like Bob Ross. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah,
Kind
that's
of
the
where
fun
I
of
am.
it. That's the fun of it for those of us who started who are, at this stage in our careers now. There wasn't a place to start with community management, and that's cool how you got into it. A lot of people like sort of just fumble into it. Blackbot, for those of you who don't know, has been a really top level player in the community space for quite some time. In fact, didn't we determine that I interviewed to be on your team in 2016 and when
Yes,
you were
you
still there?
it was like you're like, yeah, I interviewed there. I'm like, oh, thought we could have worked together. But what was interesting is Blackbot always had forums, right? Like old school, like web,
Mhm.
just go out, ask a question. And so they were always kind of ahead of the game. Was it the most engaging thing you've ever seen in your life? No. But the people that they serve with their profit, with their software and stuff are nonprofits. And so oftentimes they are the people working by themselves in one area of the organization or another, and they needed to be able to connect. So it is when I go and check it out. So shout out to the little Black Dog community team. They're holding it down over there. But I always like to say they were pretty ahead of the game as far as what was coming down for SaaS-based companies. So yeah, shout out to them and to me. I helped launch that. So, but people
Well,
kind of just kidding. Yeah.
and I think one of the key themes for you, so from Blackbot, you then came to where I was at the time, Higher Logic. I think in 2019 you came up, or 2020, early was it? No,
Yeah.
it's 2019, right?
2019. Yep.
You moved up here from Charleston, made the big move to Northern Virginia and work at Higher Logic, and then your expertise is heavily invested in sort of recognition programs for MVPs and big time community users, and you took over the hug at Higher Logic, and really it was kind of in, not to disparage anyone, it hadn't been community managed for quite some time. You talk about that program and how you sort of righted the ship.
Yeah. Funny enough, at Higher Logic, it was more of the focus on the internal community when it came down to it, once I like take a step back. But what was really cool about the hug was that I got to talk to fellow community managers, right? Like they were using the platform just like I was. So like when they were talking about issues or how to do something, when I had time, I could go in and actually have like conversations around things like strategy or suggestions or point them to resources. So like the hug itself went through a couple of iterations. Like we relaunched it, like we had to go through it, hadn't been reskinned in a while. It had that kind of old school vibe still to it, and there was a lot to clean up to figure out what made the site tick, what didn't. Because as with most companies, it was also a playground for the company. We want to try this, or we're going to do this, and let's try it out on Hug too. So a lot of that was the technical cleanup of it, but also creating for the Hug side of things, strategic cross-functional groups to work with me. Hug and Higher Logic was the first place I was a solo community manager. I don't talk about that a lot, but Blackbot spoiled me from the get-go of having 4 to 5 people on the team at any given time, which was nice. I wasn't by myself. But at Higher Logic, I use those models that we built at Blackbot so that way, as a solo community manager, I have a little help, and it came from across the organization. And one of my favorite things is the things that we would surface talking to each other in a Hug meeting that didn't necessarily have to do with the Hug community, but like people became informed. They started talking to each other. They strategized on how do we present this to our customers. And I just got to sit there and help facilitate that. So as you know, as a single community manager or lone community manager, you know, having that support from your organization is crucial. But my downfall there was as I took on two community positions. I didn't know better. I thought I could do both. And so that also became overwhelming. How do you know, handle the needs of your external community and the needs of your fellow employees? That's a lot to take on as one person, I've learned. So a lot of lessons along the way, a lot of did Shannon really need to do that kind of moments? But you know, we all have those times. So, but yeah, Hug was a fun place. Also a fun name. I'm sorry, that's just the best name. It is what it is. Everybody gets a hug on Hug. But yeah, so and then over
Well,
at Alteryx, kind of the same thing too,
yeah.
revamping or helping study the ACE program, which is their top tier community super user and advocacy program at Alteryx, to kind of get that back in order and shape and stuff like that too, so that way it could scale and grow and really make those people shine. So lots of lessons. I'm basically a walking lesson
Yeah.
of what to
Well,
do
that's the
and not
water I
to
was
do.
trying to walk towards
Yeah.
personally
Uh,
was you know, this concept of community managers in singular roles being
mhm.
asked to do a lot, right? And so you were kind of put in that position, which was an unfamiliar position, as I'm familiar with, at Higher Logic. And ultimately, I think that you filtered into a situation where you were more, like you mentioned, more focused on the internal community. But it is
Yeah.
common, and I think it's a common theme of community manager burnout or burnout for anyone, that when you don't have a team to work with and to bounce things off of, obviously you try to create those mechanisms to have a sort of team like atmosphere, but it's more difficult to breed accountability in those
Yeah.
cases. And I in fact did the same thing at a certain stage in my career, probably about the same time in my career as you did, where I allowed ADP, when I was managing the US community and working till 10 o'clock at night every night, to say to me, okay, well, we need someone to manage the Canadian community as well. And I said, sure. Um, and that was really dumb. Um, and I didn't do a great job. And we didn't do a great job with that community until we finally got somebody from Canada who could speak, who was a part of that audience, to devote, you know, most of their time to it. And that was a similar lesson to me. And I burned, like, I probably would have burned out if I had any kind of a life at the time. I was pretty much just work, work, work. And
Yeah.
it's a lesson to me, though, about a couple of different things, whether or not, like, you ought to have a localized community manager for an audience, but
Mhm.
also for the fact that if you take on too much, we have these personalities as community managers that we want to please people. We don't want to disappoint people. We have that empathy, at least those of us who are good at this. If I could say that at least you're good at it. I don't know if I am. But
You're all right.
it is kind of entreeing into that. And so, you know, obviously, like, you are building the programs, doing membership outreach with the Hug, and you're kind of diminished that, but you deserve a lot of credit for that because of the way that you brought, you know, our members into the fold over there. And then I think that really transitioned you into this role over at Alteryx, where you took on that ACE program, right? And so in order to, like, so now we're teeing it up. We know who Shannon is. Burnout is the theme. Do you want to talk
Yeah.
about just kind of the
Yeah.
progression of the last year and how we got to today?
Yeah. I mean, I had to sit down and think about this, right? Like I tell people like, I'm only about 2 weeks into like a deep introspective dive into myself. But apparently I know myself really well, which I think is interesting. I've gotten a lot of feedback around that over the past month or so of like, I'm really surprised you know yourself so well. And I'm like, shouldn't we? But anyway, I digress. So earlier this year, some of you know, some of you don't. I don't know all of you. I had a really bad health situation come up. So in January, I had to have emergency surgery and ended up in the hospital for a week. Right, like that wasn't a good time. Like I joke, I almost died. True. And today I make the soft joke that I'm missing two unimportant organs. Also accurate. But at the time, what that did was started to force me to focus on what was important, right? Not the whole like go off carpe diem, booking tickets, you know, around the world or anything like that. But it really started to there's this like fire alarm missing its battery in my head beeping. Like something is off. Like I need to figure out why what's going to make me happy, what's going to keep me going. And so not during that time because you're recovering, but I will say this, my team at Ultrix was absolutely amazing. And I think, I talked to my then manager about it. I was like, sometimes you land where you're supposed to be when you need it. And I think Ultrix was a good place for me to be at the time because of the support, because of the team. I didn't feel like I was letting everybody down because I had to be in the hospital for a week or be connected to email or get on a phone call, like trying to recover. But at the same time, it started that little missing or needed to replace that battery fire alarms started getting louder after that. As often does. Like I said, I didn't buy tickets to around the world or anything. But in March or April, I posted on Twitter, for those of you who follow me on Twitter, hello Twitter friends. I can't even remember what like caused me to tweet this. I was like, all I said was, I think I'm burning out as a community builder. There, I said it out loud. And the reaction to this tweet was probably one of the most interesting things I've seen. I'm not a big Twitter person. Like I have a nice following and those people are awesome, but I don't have 45,000, 60, none of that amount of followers. 190 people liked my tweet. Like I was shocked because a lot of them, I didn't know them, right? Like it got retweeted only once, but it didn't have a lot of, it wasn't like gaining viral traction. But what I thought was interesting is that it had over 21,000 impressions. 21,000 people, you could say, we can talk about analytics at some point, saw my tweet, and a lot of people, it resonated with them. And so that fire alarm beeping started to get louder and louder. And Ultrix had their annual conference, so that got me excited for a little bit. I was like, yeah, conference, get to know people in person, we're going to do this, right? But it was the day-to-day stuff that I was no longer performing at the level that I expected of myself. Every time I had to deal with something, I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to turn on my computer. Things that I would get excited about before, I wasn't excited about anymore. And I started to underperform. Not in a way I think most community managers tend to overperform or go above and beyond. So underperforming means I was probably just acting like everybody else, but this was not good for me because my program was is to this day, I don't know if I'll ever call them my aces, filled with amazing people doing amazing things. They needed somebody who is excited about community as they are about Ultrix. And I wasn't delivering that. I felt like I was failing my members, right? And so, changes inevitably happen in corporations. That's the one thing you get used to. Change is the only constant. And changes started to happen. And for the first time in my career, I couldn't roll with the changes. Like I was having problems adapting and like being flexible and going off to fight the fights again or convincing people to do things for the ACE program or this, that, and the other. And one day I just burst into tears. Like it was that. And my wife came over to me. She said, this isn't good. This isn't where you need to be. You are burned out. Like we need to sit down and have a serious discussion. Mostly because of what community managers do, that negativity, that toxicity can leak into your personal life because we put so much of us into people. And she is my foil that way of having better boundaries than I do, but also being able to help me identify those behaviors or things that aren't going so well. She's that person for me, somebody I can turn to. And so we sat down that weekend, reviewed our finances, and she said, you need a break. She's like, we made it so far up the corporate ladder that you can actually take a step off the corporate ladder and take a break to figure out what's next. So I actually put in my notice that following week at Ultrix. And talk about creating some cognitive dissonance, because if you've worked with me, I am not somebody who shows up grumpy or negative or, any of those things. And people were like, but we don't understand. You seem fine. I was like, I had been sharing with managers what had been going on. And some of those changes were management changes. So this person didn't know me very well yet either, they hadn't onboarded enough long time to get to know everybody on the team and get to work with us. But even, it was just interesting that I left this trail of like, what? But you seem so excited about what you do. But that's me in my facade, right? Nobody would have ever known that I was struggling or didn't want to do these things or was underperforming from my perspective. So yeah, I ended up stepping away from an amazing team, decent job, and awesome members because I just couldn't do it anymore. Like it got to that point. I don't cry at work. I really don't. I can count on my hands how many times I've done that, maybe 3, 4. But I recognize that that wasn't healthy for me either. So here I am. I'm a community manager on a break. And so I want to share with people because I don't come from a typical background you find in tech. So I want people to know that there are options out there, ways you can get help, and make sure you're just not slogging through just to slog through, because I love what I do, but I needed a break because it was burning me out. Like I was, from a job burnout perspective, as a person, I'm doing all right. But like from a career perspective, it was definitely time to take a step back. But yeah, so that's my little journey so far. So
Well, I think what you just said there too is an important note for anybody to make, which is that like there's two different people, right? Like there's you at work and there's you at home. And I think a lot of time those lines get blurred for us, particularly when we're really committed to these things, or something you and I talked about yesterday at lunch, which is that you realize so much of your social interaction was coming from work and that you needed to
yeah.
kind of reset those things, or,
Mhm.
refocus on relationships that are outside of work that may have been suffering because you're too committed to your work. What I'm really curious about is, obviously we all have that fire every day of like, we've got to get this thing done. And sometimes it's positive and sometimes, there's negative motivation, right? But like, you still
Yeah.
feel like you've got to get this thing done. And it sounds like there got to be a moment where you and Jen kind of both realized, like, either you realized I don't have that anymore, whether it's positive or negative, I can't generate that, or that you made like a cognitive choice of like, oh, this is real. Is there like other, like you mentioned the moment where you broke, you got emotional. Is there anything like specific that sort of opened up in
Yeah.
front of you?
Yeah, I mean, that day was just it was the point where I couldn't see past the situation. I'm actually freakishly good at that, which makes it hard for people to understand when I'm like, I'm struggling and I'm like, hey, let's figure out how to work through this. Right. And like that particular situation, I just was like, I don't want to. Like I had a mini toddler fit on the inside, right? Of like, and I was surprised myself because I'm just not that person. I'm not somebody who, I mean, I'm known to have a temper. For those who don't know me all that well, you can like my temper, but like for me to react with my temper is very rare. And that day, I reacted with my temper. I reacted like a 3-year-old and said, "I don't want to do that." Like it was very emphatic in my head that, and and what was being asked of me was something horribly unusual. Like it wasn't anything that like, I couldn't do blindfolded in my sleep at this point in my career. I just didn't want to. And that was the shocking part to me. And I had to say it out loud. I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And I think I'm burned out. Like, and the whole world just clicked into place. And that little fire alarm beeping noise started to get really quiet. It was like, oh yeah, okay, you figured out which one it was. It was the one in the guest bedroom that's been beeping for like weeks on end. It finally started to get quieter. And then once we started working through our life plans with my wife, the fire alarm noise stopped. Right. Like, but it's been a long time since I've just said, I don't want to do that again. Like it was an intense moment for somebody who, like I said, I like what I do. But in corporate tech, that's a lot. Every change requires new people coming in. You have to go convince them about what you're doing with your program, working with them, maintaining relationships, and every time a change or a shift happens, you have to do it again. And you constantly are doing that. And I just said for once, I didn't want to do it. And I knew I wasn't benefiting anybody if I just stayed there and did it subpar, at least from my perspective. I don't, I don't know, I don't measure myself against people. But for me, it would have been subpar. I wasn't turning out good work. And you could tell. Like, I mean, anybody who would have saw what I was, doing at the time, who knew me from previous years would have been like, huh, what's up? This isn't your usual caliber. But yeah, it was just that moment. Like, I think I was wearing the shirt that day, my Ina Garten shirt,
Ah,
right? I remember that because I was like, it's hot outside. I was just wearing some shorts and shirt, and I was like, I just don't want to do this anymore. Like, and my wife was like, then we won't, right? Like, yeah, it was a moment. But it was good to say it out loud after I stopped crying. So, like, I can't be mad at it in retrospect, but yeah, definitely that moment in time of, I can't, I'm not going to do it again. Um, so yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, much like Jay has said here in the comments here, she remembers that tweet. I remember the tweet. And going back to what you were saying before of like, it's weird, your coworker saying it's weird for Shannon to suggest that this was going on underneath, knowing you, but also seeing your Twitter and thinking like, okay, this must be somewhat real, but also like not thinking you're really like, you know, you never think that the person's like really going to go forward.
Just be
It's
like,
just like a
bye.
bad day, a bad
Yeah,
afternoon or
yeah.
whatever. And like,
Right.
so there's that, we all have that. There are days
Mhm.
like we all
Yeah.
have the micro version of it. And so I probably was guilty of not understanding that it was the macro version. I'm guessing you maybe had moments too. And so like that path to going from that tweet to the real decision, were there milestones along the way?
Yeah, I mean, after Ultrix is because I love a good conference. Like it's like my jam. I love to meet people in person. It's like how, it's like my favorite thing about community is like meeting people in real life. And the conference was amazing. The people were awesome. I was not energized by it at all. Like I was there, I did the damn thing and I did it well because that was my expectation for myself. But like when I left, it did invigorate me for a minute, right? Like it does, meeting people, getting to know them, hugging them, high-fiving them, safely during the pandemic and stuff like that. Watching people get excited about things and stuff. It really did reinvigorate me for a minute. But then the fire alarm beeping started again, right? It was like kind of like that little, like on a roller coaster. You're like, all right, well, I can get through this because I like to think of myself as a strong person who can get over the adversities of life and do things because I've had to. And so like I got up on that roller coaster and came back down. And then yeah, after that it was just kind of like, okay, well, I can't be at a conference in real life all the time to keep my positivity level up, to keep my energy level up. That's not feasible. And so it became back down the other side. But when I can't get excited about a conference to go meet people in person and like make my members excited about stuff, that was a huge thing for me. And Altrix's conference is coming up this week, and I just like I did everything to make sure everybody was successful and stuff like that. But like there wasn't anything exciting about. I knew what was going to happen. I'd get another little boost, but then I would come back down again. And so it was this ebb and flow, right? There was no like one specific point in each. It was like, okay, I got excited about this, then we're going back down. Um, but I was looking for those things too, right? Because I knew I needed that energy boost. So yeah, I would say after the conference is like there were so many things we could do and I could get excited about the program, and it just ebbed back out. It wasn't the people were amazing. It wasn't the company's fine. Ultrix is a good company to work for. I just wasn't excited about it. This is funny enough, something that, other builders I've asked you about this is that it said you have to be aware of yourself around burnout because what you project isn't, like you said, you, Paul, didn't know this was happening. We text regularly. I force you to come have lunch with me and stuff like that. But unless I'm sharing it, you wouldn't have known it, right? So, Carrie Keenan said that on Twitter. She's like, you got to know yourself. You have to know yourself because you're the only one who can truly identify what this is happening. And those were one of those moments. And then add in the changes, nothing out of the ordinary. I hit a brick wall. That fire alarm beeping was just going off too hard. By the way, for everybody listening, that's my metaphor of the week is the fire alarm beeping noise when you need to change the battery and you don't know which room it's in. Yeah. But yeah, so nothing in particular after that. People are people. Our jobs are very people centered and focused. That takes a lot of energy. But yeah, I'd say after the conference, I was just like excited, but then it fell back apart. I was like, man, I was actually kind of sad because I was like, oh, because it's really happening to me. Turns out it was. I just took a little bit longer after that to make the final
Yeah.
decision.
Well, Ryan Arsenault in the comments makes a great point, and he says, I also can't underscore enough how much the pandemic has had a lasting impact on so many seeping into work, even if we don't realize it sometimes. You obviously started this position in the pandemic, right? And do you think that set you up for a situation like this in some capacity?
I mean, not really, because I've gotten used to remote working with Higher Logic at the start of the pandemic, because just is what it is, right? So there are aspects to working, like missing out, I think. It's funny enough, and I don't say this as like somebody who's like, we should all go back to the office, but being connected to your company face to face, person to person, can have a better benefit for people, especially if you're in a customer facing role, right? You can easily get in touch with people. You're seeing other people who are going through the same things as you are. There's a little bit more of that camaraderie in an office environment. Once again, not saying anybody should go back to an office, because there's a lot of toxic things happening in offices too. But the positive of it is that you had people. Like, I could come to you and sit in your area at Higher Logic Call, and you could listen to me rant, right? Or give me
Yeah.
advice, or this, that, or the other. Or all the community managers there, I turn around and be like, hey, I have a problem. Can somebody talk out it with me? It's a little harder to do that remotely, right? You become a little bit more isolated. So, I mean, Alteryx set me up for success with equipment and getting everything I needed. And most of the company works remotely, so people were friendly, could reach out on Teams and stuff like that. But I think I relied a little too much on work for the social aspects of my life too. Because like I told you over this past week, not in meetings, I'm not on a Teams, I'm not in a Slack, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that. And I realized how fewer real life social connections I had, that I need to go back out and rebuild those in my community, like my immediate community, and to do that in real life. Because I was like, I didn't realize all of my social moments were with, remotely, and it's not via person or in Teams. So I'd say, yeah, it could help with that. Not gonna lie, it's not been easy during the pandemic. But for me, it was definitely that inner drive that I was missing as I got closer to this part of the journey. I just didn't have it anymore. It makes me sad. I'm not gonna cry
Speaking
because
of,
it feels very sad.
no, you're allowed to. This is a safe space. Speaking of safe spaces and our Higher Logic friends that we would go rant to, the first comment that we got today was from Will Mation saying these two are the worst. Just kidding. They're both my faves. But then now Allison Abel jumping in. And Allison, who's doing really exciting stuff in the community space, has a question kind of around that, which is the community industry has gone through so much rapid change in such a short amount of time. I could even say Allison, if you don't know her, has gone through so much change in such a short amount of time with the roles that she's grown into. There's more opportunities, she said, more refined roles, bigger teams, higher demands for immediate success, and more. Has that played a role at all in your desire to reevaluate your community journey, she asks?
I mean, yes, because a lot of that, and I say this with all the love of the world, community friends, a lot of that's still a lot of talk, right? That's not a lot of walk behind it. And because of the pandemic, the community industry was forced to fast forward pretty quickly. We needed to go from in-person or hybrid to completely remote virtual settings. And so people immediately came back to the thing that works, which is community. We argue all day over like, what's the original community, blah, 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 blah. Communities existed since humans have existed. Like, we could talk about that at a philosophical level. But what I'm finding is that because of those trends, even though there are more teams, let me say that, there are a lot more teams, right? But we're also seeing a lot of not fulfilling the promises made during the pandemic to those community builders, the people who took on roles as solo community builders. You'll have a team, you'll have resources, but because, especially in the tech space, recessions, economy, lack of focus on things, or not really understanding the space, there's still not enough walking the walk, in my opinion. I've heard from community managers who can't get their community to be open because of feelings from the executive level. Feelings, not data. That's still happening today. Or, hey, I thought I was going to get to build a team. And they're like, oh no, we took your head count and put it somewhere else. Like, you're still on your own, right? And because there is still that fundamental lack of understanding of what community actually is and how to translate it to corporate or tech background spaces. And so, yeah, you end up, You see all these cool things, but once you get behind it, as one of my favorite people at Alteryx said, it's a big hot mess. Like you go
Yeah.
walk in, you're like, oh no, that's not. And I'm not saying that's like not the future of community, but unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to mature as an industry to hit the expectations that people are setting now. Like people are like, oh, I need somebody with 12 years of community experience. Who?
Yeah.
Like this industry burns people out quickly. You're not going to find 12 years of experience. You're going to find a handful, right? Like that little people really stuck it out, right? But you're
I
not
mean,
going to
it's like,
find
would be
people
like
with that long.
Rich Millington, like a couple other people,
Right.
Rachel Happy,
Holly
like,
Firestone, Eric
yeah,
Plumley, people like I'm like really like even the and a lot of the people who have that experience, you don't hear from them because they're doing the work. So like my manager at Higher Logic who came on, Stacy, 15 plus years of community experience. I've never heard of her before, and that's not a bad thing, right? Like I'm not saying that like, oh, you have to know everybody, right?
at
But like she
Alteryx, you
was
mean?
yeah, at Alteryx, and
Yeah,
she
yeah,
was in the
right.
built. She built really cool programs, right? Like she's done the thing, and so like, but she'd be one of those handful, right? Like there isn't. I was like, wow, really? She's like, oh, I like what I do. I'm like, good, because that's a long time to be doing something, right? Like, but like there are people out there, but it's very far and few in between. So I'd say the community industry still has some maturing to do to meet the all the promises made over the past few years. And we're going to see a lot of spaces not do so well because of that. Um, and I don't say that to be cynical. That's not part of my burnout. That's just the realities of working in
Well, it's
this
already
industry.
happening,
Yeah.
and we're starting to
Yeah.
see like one thing that happens in times of economic downturn, unfortunately, is that education teams and community teams kind of get in
Mm-hmm.
the crosshairs because they're viewed more so as cost centers, and if not
Yep.
cost centers, longer plays,
Mm-hmm.
to where you're thinking about what can help us have the best quarter right now. Maybe your long play community team isn't that, and sometimes it ends up on the chopping block, and we've now seen that at a couple pretty high profile places these days. And it's just is what it is, right? Like that's what
Yeah.
happens with community in some capacity. And like you mentioned, there was this fast forward button where I think a lot of people built out bigger teams when things looked like they were just chugging along through that sort of tech economy that was riding high.
Yep.
And now we're taking a little bit of a step back. And if you're a community manager who's in the position, and this kind of transitions, right? Like if I'm running a community team or I have one community manager and I plan to hire two more, but the reality is I'm the marketing director and the CMO has come to me and said, I'm taking your headcount to sales, or I'm taking the headcount away, and you're going to have to do this on your own for the foreseeable future. And oh, by the way, be glad you're not fired. um,
Sure.
how do I in that scenario avoid burnout and look for the signs, either as the boss of that person or from the perspective of the person in that position?
Yeah. No, I mean, whew, leadership does play a role in this, right? Like as far as, identifying when employees are burning out. Off topic, but like managers who care, right? I've had managers who truly have cared and were able to identify those moments, right? Or where I felt comfortable enough to be transparent with them. I've also had managers who's not, right? Like because it's just like you said, in the moment, what's going to push the revenue for this quarter or this or that or the other. And it's a juxtaposition that we deal with in community, especially in corporate community, of the people versus the business, right? And you're right in the middle. You know how many times we've all had to do it. ROI, business cases, this, that, the other. But what we forget is the investment back into the people. And I'm not talking about just, full-time equivalents and, all of that, but also, are you okay? Like, how are you doing? Like, we just had this massive change. I can't hire you somebody. How do I make sure you're okay? Right. And so, I mean, I have some thoughts around that too, because I wrote them down on my little pad of how you can help guide those conversations. Because community builders, I want to make this very clear, you have to say it out loud. Nobody in corporate tech's going to read your mind and make things better for you. It's sad. They may recognize it if they're, paying attention and really understand you as a person and how you work. But otherwise, you have to be the one who stands up and say, here are my boundaries. Here is where I'm at mentally. Here's where I'm at emotionally with these things that we're doing, and how to ask for help. That's a hard one. because we are the people who like to help other people, not the other way around. But sometimes we have to ask for that help. But yeah, it's interesting. And sometimes you wish leadership would pay more attention, but I've learned to use my voice. I have to speak up. I have to be the one who makes what's important for me come to the top. So that way it's addressed or we work together towards it. Or I know it's not going to be worked on. And that's okay too. Then I can make adjustments or make the decisions necessary for me. It sounds selfish, right? It's very being me. But we have to take care of ourselves. Yeah.
You're invoking our shared former boss and mentor, Heather McNair, who used to always say, don't expect something at work that you don't ask for, whether that means a raise or professional development or a consideration for your situation. You can't expect people to be a mind reader. And that to me, when she first said that to me, I was like, okay, so can I have a raise? But no, seriously. You said no. You said no. Yeah.
That's okay. That's okay. I'll come back later. Right. But no, it was funny because community managers tend to be very non-confrontational people, right? Like not people pleasers. I mean, some, take anybody who starts out in this tends to go way too far the other direction, right? People pleasers, everything is possible, right? And you're like, not everything's possible, like you learn. But I was watching a TikTok, not to like age us. It's also for my social media friends if you're out there. So it's TikTok, and the guy said, you got to set boundaries. He's like, yeah, use your voice. He said, what is it? 30 seconds of intense discomfort or years of mild discomfort? Like, and when he posed that question that way, it was a very good question. 30 seconds of saying, hey, I'd like a raise, or 2 years before, because the pandemic did some wild things with the economy, of just slogging through and hoping to get that raise, right? Or feeling uncomfortable because you never said it out loud. And I was like, man, this bald man on TikTok's correct. I couldn't tell you who the creator is to save my life, but I was like, that is so accurate for community managers. Be uncomfortable, my friends. It'll be okay. Just do it. Gotta spit it out. So yeah.
You mentioned you had a list of like pointers or whatever for identifying on your little notepad. What do you got there? Do you got it with you?
Always. So, understanding. And so this is something one of my aces, Chris, actually responded on Twitter. I said, what questions do you all have, right? Because I don't like to talk just to talk, even though I obviously can just talk about stuff. And he said, how do you identify burnout? And I was like, because it's interesting. He's not a community person, but he is a very, high performing individual in what he does. And so I Googled, right? Because let me go ahead and say this, not an expert, not certified in any way. Like, I want to be very clear about that. This is coming from the research on the Googles and then my experience and then other people's stuff too. So I did put a couple of links. In this household, we believe in science. So they come from verifiable sources, the Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, because job burnout is not actually a medical term. Like, you can't go to the doctor and they'd be like, we diagnose you with job burnout. But what they've done is studies to identify those symptoms. So being disengaged is a big one. I don't want to turn on my computer. I don't want to open the email. I am underperforming, and I know I'm underperforming. Things are not up to my normal caliber of expectations or polish, look and feel and all of that. You think every single thing is a huge deal. And Carrie also talked about this on Twitter too. Instead of saying, because a lot of community managers have thick skins of letting things go, you kind of sigh and you're like, here's another thing I have to deal with. Like, it's not exciting, it's all the same. Or you're not seeing the high points, you're not celebrating things, you're not getting excited. Like, I always get excited for my members, for my friends and all of that, but like, you lose a little bit of that excitement about things, right? Other things include not sleeping well, not being able to focus, not taking too long to get things done. I've always struggled with time management, but over this past 6 months, I have severely struggled with it. It has been interesting where even my normal tips or little tricks that I do weren't working. I have like a little dancing tomato app, right? The Pomodoro app, keep me focused in half-an-hour chunks. But the dancing tomato wasn't even that exciting anymore. I was like, oh, fine. Like these things, it started to build, right? But yeah, apathy, disengaging, and sometimes your burnout can be, as I've learned over the past few weeks, coming from other things outside of work too. But work then becomes the catalyst for these things. You're never not thinking about work. Your sleep patterns are disrupted. You might be binge eating to make up for feeling crappy at work. You're not being active. You're not doing the creative things that you once did. I was talking to Josh Simon yesterday about being creative. I haven't been creative, like hands-on, touching, tangible things in a long time. And I've got a whole craft corner, right? Didn't have any interest. Sleep was always disrupted by problems at work. I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about issues that would need to be resolved. Um, and yeah, it was all compounded. But I did put a list so that way you can ask. The Mayo Clinic asks you questions, so you can kind of judge. So I'd recommend to people listening today, read that list. If you think you might be burning out or you're finding yourself less dissatisfied with work, go through that list. Really identify by yourself, be truthful, be candid, and answer those questions in earnest, because we all need a baseline to start from. And if somebody had given me those questions like, oh, I don't know, 7 months ago, this might have ended a little bit differently, right? But I don't have those people in my world who can be like, here's a list from the Mayo Clinic. I Googled it, so obviously you can find it, but I didn't think I was burning out. I was like, no, I'll recover. No, I was already burning out. So yeah, take that list, answer those questions. Because when I answered them, my wife was like, well, I was like, I was a big ball of burnout. And she was like, oh yeah, I could tell you that. I was like, but you're not the Mayo Clinic. Like, you're getting an official diagnosis from the Mayo Clinic's little quiz, right? Like, it's funny. But yeah, so read those questions, my friends, answer them, and then make sure you're reaching out. The follow up to that is knowing yourself, making sure you know that you're heading into burnout, and then asking for help. I wish I had asked for help earlier, right? Like that would have made a huge difference. Don't let it get to be too much. And if your business, and I'm going to say this because I'm not attached to anybody right now, if your business doesn't want to help you, if your organization doesn't want to help you out of this, you're probably not in the right place. I hate to tell you. And we all have different circumstances in life, so you can't just sometimes pick up and leave like I did. But you can make changes to make yourself happier, because we have so little time on this stupid space rock. There's no need to be unhappy for the 60 hours a week. Or at least don't let yourself get there. Like don't let yourself get there to the point where you're wondering, what am I doing here? Because it's not a good time. See, rambles, Paul. Rambling.
Yeah, no. So I'm like, the outside affirmations, I think, are absolutely really helpful, right? And so when you have a place like the Mayo Clinic or something showing you the blueprint of like, hey, some really smart people have looked into this and they want to help you and help you realize what's going on with you and take the proper steps in order to right the ship. I think that's a good feeling. And to your point before, you said, okay, work burnout is not a medical term. Well, I don't think depression was 50 years ago, right? And so these are things that we're realizing about ourselves as society kind of advances from a mental health perspective. And so I don't doubt that down the road in the near future, we start to see this getting sort of baked into your core curriculum as a manager at a company, to see these things, right? Like, and think about, okay, this person really could, because I think people have very recently been fascinated by the concept of quiet quitting. And I think a friend of ours told us that, like, because it's on LinkedIn and it's a term that people remember. And a friend of ours told us that, like, their boss accused them of quiet quitting. And it was like, come on, like, you read one LinkedIn article and now you're doing that. And it's like, we shouldn't be accusing people of quiet quitting. If we see that, we should be saying, what am I doing to make this person do that? Because I think they're related things. And so we talked a little bit about, like, what to be aware of from the standpoint of an employer. Were you, like, if you're in a situation, having gone through this now, obviously, like you said before, you're counting on people to tell you, but you're in a situation where you're managing someone who isn't telling you. How do you think you would best know that they're going through what you went through?
Behavioral changes, right? And also that's for somebody like me who often, if you've worked with me, I work at a very high energy level. Like, it's just how I
Yeah,
function.
that's an
Um,
understatement.
yeah. Like literally people are like, how do you do it? Right. And I'm like, well, I'm an introvert. So at some point I'll leave you people alone and go recharge my battery. But because I think what I do is important enough that you have to bring that energy. Like I'm selling you something, right? So like, because I am sometimes having to sell people stuff. But from a manager perspective, look at your high performers. Because here's the other part to burnout that I've learned about working with high performing members, but also high performing friends. My industry, like connections are great. I love community, but I also tend to network very well outside of community too. And a lot of my mentors and people that I rely on do not sit in this industry because I need their different perspectives on things. Um, they're also type A because I find people who are my opposite. So they're very type A, very generally analytical, logical, 100% thousand hitting the ground running, like it is just, it's just like yeah, kind of people, but they don't just a little bit different, like energy wise. On the other side of that spectrum of like disengaging, all of that good stuff, is performing so hard, so fast, so quickly that you literally burn yourself out, like doing too much, being constantly connected, never taking a break, always at a level 10, never be able to ratchet it back down. And so I learned that this week, actually, from the Cleveland Clinic. But the opposite, too, is also when you have somebody who can't seem to disengage, who can't seem to like not check their email when they're on vacation, who will answer you 5 seconds after 10 p.m. because they have no boundaries. So they're putting all of their energy into that as well. So you actually have to pay attention to the behavior. Do I have a high caliber performer who seems to be burning the candles at both ends and is eventually going to fall off that whatever vehicle they're on? Or do I have somebody who's completely just was great to work with, high energy, but all of a sudden starts to slow down? The caliber of their work starts to slip. They're not, pushing, they're not maybe as like, I would say perky, but the energy level isn't there. And these things come from emotional intelligence, but also just observing. But like Ryan said, it's hard to do that in a pandemic when you only see the square, right? Like this is all you get, for the most part, is this area of somebody. But how do you identify those? Is actually paying attention, of being observant, because just as I've burned out in this way, I've had friends burn out the other way, like where they just go so hard until they hit that wall and then they become incapable of functioning. You're like, are you okay? And they're like, I did too much. Like it's that more of the very erratic version of burnout. And whereas this, I guess it was quiet quitting. I don't know. I think the term is silly. Where
It's so silly.
the same side, yeah. So as usual, in typical Shannon form, I went the other way. I didn't go the other direction of erratic behavior, because I didn't want to bother people with it. Right? This felt like something I had to figure out, that there weren't a ton of people that I could rely on, which was also a lie. My community people rallied around me. That tweet about burning out, 54 responses, several phone calls later, like it, the people are there when you need them. But yeah, keep an eye out, my manager friends. Like it's atypical behavior you wouldn't expect from them. That is a huge indicator that something's going on. Doesn't always have to be burnout. Could be a family issue. You don't need to ask questions. You just need to acknowledge it. Could be personal
Yeah.
issues. And as the workforce changes, these skills, emotional intelligence, observational skills, are actually going to become more important as managers because the generations behind us are expecting them. So, just something to keep an eye out. But I see a lot more of it, managers learning to, people more and more. So that way they are, hitting those marks. But then also creating an environment where an employee can come to you and be transparent. I am burning out. I'm overwhelmed. I don't know what to do here. Like, that's the point of managers, is to help you work through that. Sometimes I think not everybody's actually built for that. So it's just a couple of tips, like make an environment where they can come to you. Ask them blatantly, are you okay? Like not, and then repeat it, because if it's somebody like me, I'm gonna be like, oh, yeah, fine. And then like repeat it again. Are you
No,
okay?
really. Yeah.
Yeah, like, are
Yeah.
you like, let's have a conversation. Don't record it. Don't do anything to like, all of that. Make it a safe place for them to say, yes, I need your help. I'm not doing well here. But you don't get that experience with all managers. So if you're out there and you're leading people, pay attention. They would really appreciate it because they're people too.
Well, one of
So
the
yeah.
things we talk about all the time, or I talk about all the time, so sometimes I guess I just say it's like the royal we, um, is that the work is never done for a community manager. No matter how many people are on your team, right? You work at Alteryx, there are like 20 people on that team. It could extend to 100 because you could always do more for your community, right? And I would talk all the time about how like there's always that something, no matter how much you're working, even if you're working 12, 14, 16 hours a day, like I was when I had the US and Canadian communities at ADP, there was always something in my head that I wasn't able to reach, that just was right out of reach, that I could be doing for people and couldn't. And still some of those things to this day haunt me or they inspire me, right? Where it's like, oh my gosh, we're going to do that thing that I could never do. So awesome because we have more resources or because we can get to it this time. And that's not always true. You and I joked yesterday that your wife, Jen, is in support and like the day just ends, right? and it's like, oh my God, how wonderful would that feel?
Right.
You know, it's one of those things where, you know, and particularly too, when you are this person who does this work, you want to continue doing it. I have friends who are really able to end their day or really able to compartmentalize and use their time really efficiently. And I think those of us who are in, you know, I don't think it's uncommon to not be the best time manager in the world and be a community manager, right? Because you're trying to kind of, you're almost like a romantic, right? Like, and you're trying to be all things to all people. And that in and of itself is a trap. That we're prone to just walking right into, I think more so than a typical corporate employee. So I think that's, I don't know, my 2 cents on that front.
I mean, you're right. Like I've not met a community manager. Well, I say that I'm sure I have, but I don't know them well enough. Who aren't those people who are constantly thinking about the next thing because community doesn't stop when I turn my laptop off, right? Like this version of community stops, this Alteryx community, this Black Bug community. I can walk away from that, right? I've taught myself how to walk away from that at the end of the day. But because of what we do is so tied to society, you see something out in your community, your friends, your family, your barista at the local Starbucks, whatever it may be, you are inspired by everything that's happening around you. How can I bring that to my community? Like your brain doesn't ever shut off, right? Like I've seen things.
Yeah.
That's why they're like, go out to the world. You know, you'll get ideas. You hear people like David Spink say that kind of stuff. Like, but you know, I'm picking on him because he popped up in my head first. Like that thought leadership vibe of like, just be inspired by the real world community and bring it back to yours, right? Like that very much like that tweet. You know, like you're like, yeah, but it's true. But it's true, right? You're like, oh yeah, like we'll see stuff out there and be like, oh yeah, that'd be great. So for example, like at Super Forum, when we did like a virtual farm tour, I was out and about, just saw a bunch of kids, and I was like, we need to involve children in like a virtual event for, you know, Super Forum. So that way the kids could be there, the parents have something to like interact with, you know, really include beyond just what they do for a living. It was really cool, right? Because little kids were there and they're all like excited about the cows on the computer. Some of them weren't. It was hilarious. They're like, "This isn't cool, mom." You know, like we're like, it's still fun to see that, but like because of that, there is that blurred line. Anything that I do with friends or you know out in the real world, I can't translate it to what I do for my members. So my brain's always going, how do I do this? How do I get this done? How do I, you know, try that out? But also, how do I keep maintaining that? So your brain is constantly going. Whereas, yes, my wife is an extraordinarily high performer, great at what she does. Her team loves her. But the woman says at 5 o'clock, I'm done. Yeah. Like, she's good. I will see you tomorrow at 8 a.m. And I envy her sometimes. I'm like, how do you do like she's great. Yeah, she's doing cool things for them, but in a way that makes sense for those boundaries to be in place. Where I'm like texting myself an email about something I saw in the real world that I wanted to do for my community. But yeah, I agree. It's hard to turn your brain off. It really is, especially in this role because it's all about the people. So
I was just on vacation for like 10 days and when I came back, my sort of scribble, like mind dump Google sheet that I use, which is like the most inefficient way to organize these things. So back to organization issues amongst the community folk, was just 400 different mind dumps from various times of the day over the 10 days that I was out. And I had to spend like half a morning sorting them out. And like, some of them were there 8 times. It was like, just this is 8 versions of the same thing, or whatever. But it speaks to what you're talking about, which is that we're always thinking about this stuff, and it's a good thing, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily bad, but like you've got to keep an eye on yourself and do your best to treat yourself the best. That's a cliche that I just came up with on the spot. Do you want to, as we close out here and reach the 1 hour mark, just have any closing thoughts on this topic? Because I know it's very important to you and to all of us.
Well, hell, I walked away from a job because of it. So of course I have closing remarks. A couple of things, because I like to be transparent, right? Not everybody can do what I did. And I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back or be like, oh, I'm amazing, you know. But my circumstances in life have allowed me to be able to take that step back. I have a wife. We don't have tiny humans, right? We don't have a large mortgage. We don't have car payments. Shockingly, we live freakishly well within our means, which is good on us and also made this possible. So I want people to know that when you hear the extreme stories of these, I quit my job because I just couldn't do it anymore. One, I did quit my job. I was like, but I was able to do it. So please take consideration your circumstances in life. You probably have other people who are dependent on you. Like we help our families, I'm not gonna lie, but make sure that you're taking those things into consideration. And if you can't just get up and walk away, do dedicate some time to figuring out why you may be unhappy where you are and to try to make a plan over a certain time frame to say, how do I get there? And then rely on the people around you to help you get there. The conversations I've had recently are much more around, what are you going to do next? And everybody wants to know, right? I have no idea. It's only week 2, so we're working on it. But I really tell people, like, if you can answer those questions in a negative way for Mayo Clinic, it's time for a change. It really does affect the rest of your life, as especially in the American culture, we work a lot. So how you're doing at work will affect how you do in your personal life. So sit down, think about where you are, how to make those steps happen. Because at the end of the day, no manager is going to do that for you. As much as they may want to, they can't. You have to do the work. And that was the biggest thing that came out of the Cleveland Clinic one was, here are some things you can do that involve other people, but you have to do it yourself. And really, this is probably the cliche part, is getting to know yourself, getting to understand what those signs are of you not performing as well, or maybe burning the candle at both ends and ending up in dark places after those cycles, and saying, I need to do something better for me, because if you're not taking care of yourself, you can't take care of other people. Like, I don't know how else to say it. That's the cliche, Paul. You can't take care of others if you don't take care of yourself.
It's extremely well said.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure that's on the internet somewhere, like, can't take care of yourself. Yeah. So take care of yourself. It's important. And at the end of the day, there's only one of you. So we need everybody's voice. We want everybody's perspectives. You need to keep yourself going. But the other part is reach out to your people. Please reach out to me. I don't care if I don't know you. I'll take 15 minutes to listen to you. 15, 20, 30 minutes. I sat on phone calls for hours with people. Like, these are things that I think we need to support each other and say the hard part out loud. So use your voice. I did say I'd offer some grandma advice, because if you don't know me, I love my grandma. So I'll end with this. She said, you can't live your life to make the world happy. You can only live your life to make yourself happy. And if you're not happy, you have to do something to change it. And this is from a tiny 83-year-old lady who's seen more than I could ever describe on a webinar or anything. And one of the reasons I'm here. So I take that with a big dose of Shannonism, and we're going to go figure out what makes me happy, because I can't live my life making the world happy. So yeah. So there's a little grandma advice.
Yeah, love it. Yeah. Love it. Well, thank you so much, Shannon. This has been awesome. if you want to connect with Shannon, if you want to reach out to Shannon, she's not that busy right now. Find her on LinkedIn
Some
or
time.
Twitter. No, but Shannon invited you to come talk to her. If you're experiencing burnout in particular, Shannon, of course, mentioned that she wishes she had spoken to somebody about this 3, 4, maybe 5, 6 months ago. If you're in that position, maybe Shannon can help you achieve an outcome that is good for you. So I really appreciate this time, Shannon. Of course, Shannon has started a conversation on our community, Social Media Pulse. That is socialmediapulse.community. I put this link in the ticker, and it's ridiculous. So if you just go to socialmediapulse.community, you can find that. And in fact, actually, I can fix that link.
When community managers make post titles, I'm sorry, y'all.
No, I can fix it. This will work too. So if you just go there, boom. Social media Pulse
there you
community. Yeah, I forgot that I could do that in a brief moment of lapse. But again, thank you, Shannon, so much. This was an awesome time. I really appreciated it. Thank you so much to Agorapulse for giving us this venue. The Trust has been such a fun thing that I've been just so excited to be able to do. And Shannon, second show ever in the box.
Yes.
Thank you. And
number 2.
We'll chat. We'll awesome. Chat again soon.
I gotta go at least a month before I see you. Okay.
Okay. Here comes the music back.
Here comes the music. Dancing to the music.
All right.